Listen up, fellow babies. It's time for Hold My Order Terrible Dresser, the deep dive history nerd WKRP in Cincinnati podcast. I am Rob McDougall, one of the hosts of this podcast, and the other host of this podcast is my good friend Mike Grasso. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Rob. Hey, we're at the end of another season of WKRP. Can you believe it?
That's right. Congratulations. Congratulations, everyone. Listeners, thanks for sticking with us. We are at the end of the sometimes wonderful, often funny, sometimes a little bit downbeat, a little depressing season 3 of WKRP in Cincinnati. It's not the end of season 3 of Hold My Order. We'll have our traditional season wrap-up episode in 2 weeks.
Yep.
But we have got to the last 2 WKRPs of the 1980-81 TV season, Til Debt Do Us Part and Clean Up Radio Everywhere. And I guess we're going to start with Til Debt Do Us Part. This is a Johnny episode, written, in fact, by Howard Hessman, Johnny Fever himself, along with Steve Campman. This is the last Steve Campman episode before he left for, I was going to say Greener Pastures, is being a character on Newhart, Greener Pastures. Anyway, he left WKRP after this.
Yes.
But
stayed in the MTM family, though. Yep.
Stayed in the MTM family, that's right. But written by Howard Hessman, which I think will be significant.
Yes.
This episode starts out, Johnny's ecstatic. He's happy because his ex-wife, Paula, is getting remarried.
Yes.
And the reason he's happy, of course, is that this means he's off the hook for the alimony he's been paying for years. This is Paula, the mother of Lori, who we met a season ago, I think.
Yes. Yep. And Doctor's Daughter. Yeah. And some lovely, I mean, we've been seeing it again and again the last few weeks of the podcast, Rob. All kinds of continuity. WKRP had an arc before it was cool.
That's true. It's true. We started off the podcast by saying the show's not serialized, and it's not really uber serialized like a Netflix show or something like that, but it is, but they care about continuity, or they have come to care a lot about continuity.
Yeah.
So Johnny is thrilled that Paula is getting remarried until he meets the fellow that she's going to remarry, Buddy Gravers. And Buddy is, well, how would you describe him? He's played by Hamilton Camp, who we remember as Del Murdoch of Del's Stereo and Sound.
Yeah.
And I loved Hamilton Camp in that episode as Del.
Yeah.
I love him less in this episode, but he is, he's a jerk. He's kind of he's a diminutive, hyperactive bundle of improv comedy tics, basically. He's just sort of like flailing around and
he's definitely committeeing all over the place.
He's committeeing all over the place, that's right. Among other things, he's clearly got roving eye for Jennifer and Bailey. And the plot, such as it is Johnny is kind of torn between his desire for Paula to remarry and, his desire to warn him off this guy. And they have very awkward dinner. The three of them plus Jennifer, who's got looped in, and we can get to that too. There's a sort of a very sketchily drawn, like, sitcom, let's have them pretend that they're together sort of a thing.
Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Like it might have happened with Hoyt Axton a couple of seasons ago. But I guess it's payback, with Jennifer, having Johnny play the boyfriend husband in I Do for Now.
That's right. Jennifer owed him to pretend to be his girlfriend. I don't know why he couldn't have taken Bailey, since also in this episode he is planning a vacation with Bailey. They're supposed to be heading off to Jamaica together.
Could there have been a better destination for a couple of folks in 1981 than Jamaica? My God, that must have they had a big tourism and marketing push in the 80s. They were trying to kind of trade in on that Bob Marley chic, the sort of reggae kind of come down and relax to Jamaica,
Yeah, maybe that they were fighting people's rampant fears of the Bermuda Triangle in those days. Anyway, it culminates in this long dinner where Johnny and Paula, well, it's hard to summarize it briefly because there's a lot of emotional beats in that long conversation, but basically they both confess to still having feelings for one another. Mm-hmm. He does kind of warn her off him, but she sort of appreciates his concern, but says she's going to marry him anyway. And the episode just kind of ends there.
Yeah. Johnny ends up kind of, he ends up getting what he wanted in the form of being off the hook for the alimony and that. But
I guess he realizes he is sad. That is the emotional growth. Is it? He starts out dancing around the booth, and in a sort of very venal way, he's just like zippity doo dah. Yeah. I'm not paying alimony anymore.
My ex-wife reminds me of Darth Vader. That kind of stuff.
That's right. That's right. Oh, actually, I think the line is, he's like, she caught Darth Vader at a vulnerable moment. Like she would date Darth Vader.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
A nice little Star Wars reference in the year of Empire Strikes Back, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so his arc is just that he realizes that it's not an unalloyed good, that something is ending, and he thanks her for raising Laurie.
Yeah, that really hit me hard, because I think, Doctor's Daughter, that episode, I think we both really liked how much depth it gave Johnny as a character. The regret that he had about not being more involved with her, and sort of realizing that she'd become her own woman without him being around. And this episode kind of closes that parentheses, doesn't it? It kind of gives Johnny a chance to not only appreciate Laurie for who she is, warts and all, but, also give Paula, her much deserved due for raising their daughter.
Yeah.
Okay, what can we do for you?
Get to know me.
Huh?
Get to know me. Look, I was flying a client in, and Paula decided to surprise you and fly in with me.
Paula?
Your ex, my bride-to-be.
Buddy.
Johnny! She's told me a lot about you, John.
Where is Paula anyway?
Paula who? Humor. I was,
So, Mike, how did you like Till Debt Do Us Part?
This one, I think it's another casualty of the phenomenon of an episode of WKRP like bouncing back and forth too quickly between wacky comedy and fairly serious drama. Even though most of it's contained in that two-hander with Paula and Johnny at the end of the episode, it kind of, like, the tone just didn't work for me at all. I think part of that is, I think Hamilton Camp as Del, as you said, he slots into that part perfectly. He inhabits it. He can do a 2-minute, Robin Williams-esque sort of monologue about his stereo equipment, and it makes
that radio ad, I love. Yeah. I'm just going to put that clip back in again.
Yeah, that's great. But in this episode, he dominates the action too much, I think, in the few scenes that he's on, and he telegraphs his intent, I think, a little bit too broadly. He's so obviously a bad guy. There's no subtlety to it.
Yes.
Or not a bad guy, but again, the kind of person you don't want your ex to marry. And, that undercuts a little bit of the pathos that we have at the end of the episode with Paula and Johnny kind of talking about Buddy while he's not there. And that undercuts that. And then Paula and Johnny, which I think we're going to focus on a little bit, I think it's a very well written scene, but again, it feels like a little stage play. It doesn't feel like a sitcom to me,
Yeah, I want to get to that, but just the sort of Hamilton Camp, since we're talking about him now, I love, you said he's committeeing all over the place. He's just like, he's so sort of like antic and
using all of his
hyperactive,
using all of his costume and props, like his little digital watch, like he's
digital watch, his pilot's jacket. He's a pilot.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Can somebody give me out in the audience an occupation?
There's nothing to do. The fact that he's a pilot is just like, give me an occupation. Give me a.
What would somebody like that wear on their wrist, perhaps? Oh, a digital watch. All right, great. I'll integrate that into the scene.
If he was on the Starship Enterprise, it might have gone something a little like this. Yeah, part of the backstory of this episode is that
this is amazing.
So Howard Hessman co-wrote the script with Campman, and you could see obviously Hessman taking advantage of the opportunity to fill in more of Johnny and really write a nice character piece for Johnny, but also he was writing it for Ruth Silvera, one of his colleagues from the committee, who plays Paula, his ex-wife.
Oh,
so she was a committee member, and you could imagine that maybe this is an attempt to kind of recapture For Love or Money, when Julie Payne came on and played Buffy, and they had this amazing chemistry, and that really drove this that two-parter. Originally, the part of Buddy, her new husband, was going to be played by John Matuzak, pro football player turned actor, right?
Yeah.
I have to defer to you. He was an Oakland Raider, but if people want to know who Matuzak was, but
one of the great 70s Oakland Raiders, under John Madden and Al Davis, the owner. kind of that classic bad boy kind of thing. And like many professional football players of the 1970s, when the 80s dawned and they had to retire, he went to Hollywood, like O.J. Simpson, like Merlin Olsen, like Rosie Greer, like all of these other folks we've talked about. Like it was a path you took in that era.
Yes, absolutely. So he was supposed to do it. But they brought him in for the table read on the Monday. They make these episodes in a week. And I guess he just bombed at the table read. He wasn't funny or it didn't work, whatever. They just kind of realized it was not going to work. And so they had to fill the spot at the very last minute. And the Michael Castle book and also Jamie Weinman's blog both tell the story that Hessman and Hugh Wilson decided that, the best person to take over the part at short notice was Hamilton Camp. And on the one hand, this is both makes sense and doesn't make sense. Like, they know that Hamilton Camp is reliable. He's a friend. He can come in and hit his marks and he did half steal the Hold Up episode.
Right.
On the other hand, he's not the most obvious person to replace a big, good-looking football player. And
I know. When you told me this, I kind of mentally substituted John Matuzak in each of the scenes. And while I couldn't picture him doing Hamilton Camp's shtick, all of a sudden the things that Paula says about him and the way that he acts make a lot of sense. You know what I mean?
Yes. And so they actually had to change some of the plot. So in the episode we saw, Buddy is a pilot and he shows up for no real reason. Why is he even in the station? In the original script, I believe, so he's this big, athletic, good-looking guy, and Paula has brought him around kind of to rub it in, to sort of show him off to Johnny. A lot of things would have worked differently because then Johnny starts out being glad she's marrying him, and then gradually realizes he's not a good guy. Whereas with Hamilton Camp as Buddy, we know he's a loser like in the first 2 seconds, and which means that he has kind of no redeeming qualities, and so Paula's decision to marry him is much less understandable, and she sort of comes off as kind of pathetic, or just sad, and she has to say like, oh, it's really hard to be single, and they have to work at the end of the episode to convince us that this is okay. That they're getting together. That maybe they wouldn't, I don't know how Matuzak would have played it, but maybe they wouldn't if he seemed to have more redeeming qualities.
Yeah, I mean, the way it ends up feeling in this episode is that Paula is kind of settling. She even kind of hints at it a couple times in the conversation with Johnny, like, well, he's got some good qualities, like the jet, like those kind of things. Like, it's made to kind of seem a little bit sadder than it would have been if he was like this, rich, jet-owning. Oh, I looked up the height of the comparative heights of John Matuzak and Hamilton Camp. So, John Matuzak, during his playing days, was 6'7", 282 pounds. And Hamilton Camp weighs in on IMDb at 5'2". So
the tail of the tape, folks.
John Matuzak has 1.5 feet on Hamilton
tail
Camp.
Of the tape, yeah. And I mean, not that people should get married solely for height or looks, but like if you look at Matuzak, and Matuzak is sort of like a big, burly, I would say good looking in a 70s way kind of guy.
He's definitely in the 70s.
I mean, he definitely in some parts that he plays, his when I say he's good looking, like he kind of has a bit of a caveman vibe.
Yes, he does.
In fact, he played in the movie Caveman with Ringo
Starr and Raquel Welch, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember that movie.
And then this isn't going to convince anyone that he is a catch, but people on the Gen X millennial line that you inhabit, Mike, John Matuzak's most famous role, what was the guy's name?
Sloth
on from the Goonies, horribly disfigured. Is he a brother or a sidekick?
Yeah,
or whatever?
he's like the child locked in the basement.
The child locked in the basement of the bad guys.
Yeah,
yeah. So this role that he got because of his impressive physique. Matuzak died of a drug overdose quite young, I think. Actually, he didn't outlive the 90s.
He was one of the first football casualties of painkillers, which again were being handed out like candy back in the 1970s in football locker rooms. not like many of the other 1970s raiders, a steroids casualty, but in fact, a painkiller. He died at 38 in 1989. So yeah, died very young.
I don't want advice from you.
Well, what do you want?
Well, I'll tell you what I don't want. I don't want to see my former husband drooling over the prospect of my remarrying.
Why didn't you just say so?
Well, I didn't know it until now. Well, I guess I'd like you to feel a little sad.
I am a little sad.
He's great in bed.
I said I'm sad.
I am too.
So here we are, sad in Cincinnati.
Anyway, on that happy note, so yeah, my theory about this episode. So there's all that stuff about the how the changing of the casting, I think, changes the feel.
Yeah.
Even separate from that, I imagine that Hessman's idea here was to redo For Love or Money, not to have the same storyline, but basically, get one of his friends from the committee, and I got to figure that his writing process would be a lot of improv, working this out in a kind of an improv way. So just as in For Love or Money, he and Julie Payne, went off together and suddenly realized they had enough material for 2 episodes.
Right.
Here they sort of go off, and you said it feels like a play more than a sitcom.
Yeah.
And that's completely, I think, in both good ways and bad ways. The long scenes, the long restaurant scene, even the scene with Hamilton Camp in the big guy's office, there are these meandering, they feel improv or created through improv, and it's not really clear where they're going. You said it goes from, it seems funny, then it seems sad, then, it's believable, but the feel is really tonally, it feels like improv, not in the sense of like wacky, zany improv, but
does it feel like a role-playing session, maybe? Or like,
maybe a role-playing session, yeah. But
like one of those heavy sessions where you get into a lot of emotional stuff, It
could be, or some sort of when they walk into that completely unconvincing Armenian restaurant at the end for the final scene, and there's nobody there. Yeah. They sort of make a joke out of it, but what it looks like, well, you said in the notes, it looks like the Greek deli from Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
But it also, to me, it just looked like a stage set for some little semi-serious play we might see in San Francisco, and just minimalist stage set, 4 characters at a restaurant. The scene, it's light, it's heavy. It's nice that they explore a bunch of complex emotions, right? I guess they do sort of, in that weird way, circle around the strangeness of divorce and 2 people whose lives were totally intertwined, but whose lives are no longer intertwined.
Yeah.
But Jamie Weinman said that he thought this was the most depressing episode of the series. Those are strong words, and I'm not sure I agree. As we've seen this season, WKRP can sometimes be a downer. I don't think I wouldn't call it that, but tonally, it's another one that leaves you just kind of sitting on the couch going,
yeah. I shouldn't say I hated the episode completely, because I think that one of the most believable things about the episode is how, like, brittle and jagged that conversation between Paula and Johnny is. I mean, it's not cartoonishly so. Like, if Buffy had come in with a real chip on her shoulder and hadn't been the flighty hippie, they could have gone, again, like, my ex is the Antichrist kind of thing. With Paula and Johnny, the complexity there is, as you say, really, really well portrayed by both of the actors. Just the amount of back and forth that goes on between Johnny goes in, wanting her to get married, finds out that Buddy's a scumbag, and just kind of like starts to have second thoughts about his own feelings about Paula. But then Paula kind of gives as good as she gets, you know what I mean? Like, Paula knows that Johnny just wants to get out of the alimony. You know, like there's a great way in which that scene is really realistic. But I don't go to WKRP for realistic post-divorce conversations. You know what I mean? I go to it for a couple of chuckles, and maybe Les says something funny, and then Mantooth bartender. I don't want to sit here and watch the shattered remains of a marriage that's been dissolved for almost 2 decades, and watching these people kind of crawl out of that wreckage.
Yeah, which that's nicely put, and it circles around what was going to be my next question, which is what you thought of Ruth Silvera.
So here's the thing. I actually didn't know that she was part of the committee. As I look back on the episode with that new knowledge, I kind of wonder why she wasn't better. I really didn't feel... I felt like in a lot of ways, like her line reads were a little flat. I didn't feel like she gave any of those, like that give and take, that punch and counterpunch, a lot of emotion, you know? And again, there is a middle ground between, Buffy as a portrayal, as a part, and somebody like Paula. I think if you find somewhere in the middle there, if she had been a little like more snide, a little sharper, a little more sarcastic, like that would have worked a lot better for me. But she didn't. I don't know. She didn't feel like she had a lot of emotion to what she was saying.
I thought emotionally she was. Well, again, it's complex because the emotion is all over the place. Is she needling Johnny? Is she pathetic? I think it's sad. I just think she doesn't need Buddy. She raised Laurie on her own. If she didn't need Johnny, she certainly doesn't need Buddy, the character. But as the performer, she's clearly nowhere near as big or as broad as Julie Payne or Hamilton Camp. Mm-hmm. You could see being in an improv group with Hamilton Camp, might have been a pain at times, like just him sort of like going off on his thing.
Michael Scarn, FBI.
There's more than one kind of improv.
Yes.
But I don't know if she gets, you say the emotion wasn't really there. I also don't think she gets one solid laugh. Like Julie Payne, Julie Payne is a little bit like a female Hamilton Camp. She was over the top, but she was funny. And, 30 years later, I'm still laughing at things that she said. And I just don't think that, you're saying the emotion is confusing and doesn't quite land. And I'm saying that Silvera doesn't make us laugh. And so what are we left with?
Yeah. I'm going to take a step back now, because now that we've done all this comparison, between Paula and Buffy, think about what this says about Johnny as a person and the kind of partners he picks, because it feels like from Paula's like wardrobing and manner that she's a pretty responsible person. You know what I mean? Like, she's not going to go off to Vermont. She's not going to...
Well, she had to be the mom. I think that maybe... we don't know what she was like in
the early 60s when they met.
Which was like 20 years ago, but Johnny left and she had to grow up and be the mom and be responsible. So she is not typed as being a sort of flower child anymore.
But and again, if she raised Laurie, a lot of what we see in Laurie, like, well, Laurie's kind of a combination of both of her parents. You know what I mean? Like, she's ready to get married at 20 and, wander around the country, but she's also got that, urge to kind of settle down, right? And like, go to school and do all the things that she was talking about doing with, I forget the guy's name that she was dating.
Oh yeah, crap. God. I love that guy. Why am I blanking on his name?
Yeah, I know.
Anyway.
Justin.
Oh, yeah, he's asleep in the van.
But yeah, like, she kind of shows off both of those sets of character traits. But I find it interesting that Johnny he seems to vacillate back and forth between, I mean, you could even look at Bailey as someone who's a bit like a Paula, you know what I mean? Like, a little bit demure, a little bit sort of reserved, and then, Johnny ends up with somebody like Buffy at some point in his life. So he goes back and forth between those two poles,
Right.
Bailey, I'm sorry you startled me. How's your cold?
Oh, a little better.
Uh-huh. Where are you going on vacation?
Well, I'm not sure. Why?
Well, if you play your cards right, it could be a vacation for two.
What are you suggesting, Fever?
I am suggesting palm trees swaying in the offshore trade wind. The hue and cry of exotic birds wheeling across an azure sky. I'm suggesting bronzed, supple flesh, pungent odors, sensuous rhythms in a tropical paradise. In short, Adam and Eve on excursion rates.
Alone? Together?
Hopefully.
Separate bedrooms?
Details. We can work this out.
Where?
Jamaica, island of homegrown fun.
Well, this is all so sudden, I'll have to think about it.
Act now. Don't delay. Offer limited.
Am I paying for this?
Details.
So we were talking about the trip to Jamaica a little earlier, and I don't know, for a pair of people as casual as Johnny and Bailey have seemed to be, like, I don't know, going to Jamaica is a big commitment, like one way or the other. Like, Bailey says separate rooms, right? Well, we'll just play that by ear,
This is one of those moments where you really wish you had more information about their relationship, because at times it's like they haven't gone out in a while, and at other times, Johnny will forget, he completely forgets that he's supposed to see a movie with her. And then here he's like do you want to go to Jamaica with me? And that just seems like a bigger, what is the status of their relationship? And, the 70s, the 80s, maybe they were different. Who knows?
They were a little different. I get the feeling. The reason why Johnny gets so excited is because now he can take his vacation. So
he can afford to go to Jamaica because if he's not paying double alimony anymore. So Johnny has had 2 ex-wives, but it occurs to me that Buffy was not his wife, right?
No,
because
I don't think we ever meet the second ex-wife.
The whole palimony thing. So there's actually, and he gave her some money too. So there's another ex-wife which they were, keeping in their back pocket if there are any other members of the committee that Hessman wanted to write an episode for.
Oh, God. Maybe they could have gotten... oh, Christ, I'm forgetting everybody's names today. What's his name to play her in drag? The guy from Hotel Ocean View.
Oh, hi, Mickey.
Hi, Nikki. How's Vicky?
Vicky's fine, Mickey.
No, they went on chemistry.
Yeah, that would have been great. Bailey in this episode, again, she doesn't play a huge role, but she basically bookends the episode because of the trip. The funny thing is, of course, is that Herb manages to intercept Johnny as he's talking about getting a vacation together, and Herb says, "You got a travel agent? I got a travel agent." Again, Herb's probably gonna get some kind of kickback or commission for this.
Yeah, he's shocked that Johnny doesn't have a travel agent, which is kind of funny in and of itself. Yeah. And what he says, step into the 80s. Everybody's got a travel agent. It's the 80s.
I know, it's so great. So what's the story behind that? Well, the story behind that is that, of course, there were travel agents before the 80s, but what's the one new addition that they have now in like the late 70s, early 80s? They've all got computers that can get into the central airline booking computers and get people on flights really easily and really quickly.
Yes, that's right. The sort of computers of flight booking. And now, of course, computers, fast forward 20 years and computers would kill the travel agent.
Right. But at this crucial point, you had to have somebody, a middleman, to get onto the computer for you and get it for you. Like the Jennings in The Americans,
Yes, it becomes a good 80s kind of a job. I hadn't thought of that. The Jennings are travel agents too. I once met a guy, he was a grad student at MIT who did super complex mathematics, as they do at MIT.
Sure.
And I asked him about applications, and I don't know if he was pulling my leg, but he was like, sort of, how do you solve equations with 37 variables? And I asked him about applications, and he said, well, it's used for airline ticket pricing.
Oh.
Sort of a super high level mathematics approaching the singularity at MIT.
This is why we
airline pricing.
This is why we all have to pay more for airline tickets than we used to. I find it really interesting that like the travel agent becomes this almost like status symbol. You know what I mean? When you were talking about like things that computers do now about travel that they didn't do back in the day, every time my family would go on a long road trip, we would dutifully go along to AAA. To one of the
I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, to one of the main AAA offices where they would put together a custom book called a triptych that would show you the path in a little highlighted marker all the way to your destination, just like Google Maps today. But somebody would be sitting, some intern in a AAA office would be sitting there putting together the spiral-bound thing of all of these pages.
With these little skinny maps, and then they highlight it with the highlighter. Yes,
Yep.
Friend of mine, friend of the podcast, Steve might be listening. So I went on this long, crazy road trip early in grad school, 26 states, every kind
of... Much like Bono of U2, you wanted to see America.
I was a lot like Bono of U2 in the sort of rattle and hum era Bono. And coming to conquer America, having finished that and feeling quite pleased with myself as a world traveler, and I published all my adventures in a zine because it was the 90s. I then gave my friend and housemate Steve a hard time about relying on triptychs, because the triptych is the sort of linear map where you don't go off the path. But I want to confess now, 20 years later, Steve, that I actually love triptychs, and my family crossed the continent twice using triptychs, and so I wish I hadn't put on airs, because triptychs are actually like delightful and fun. So I don't know why I had to be a snot, other than I was in my 20s and it was the 90s.
That format of travel planning actually goes back to like the 1600s. I saw I was online somewhere, some manuscript where basically it was a custom-made linear, like with on either side of the road that you take, here's that pub that you'll pass at this particular mile, and here's a tree, and here's like a rock formation. And so like,
nice.
Basically they would do these things for pilgrims and travelers and other folks in the same vein as the triptych, where you just basically have long skinny page after long skinny page of travel instructions. So The AAA didn't start this one. They just stole it from people in the 16th century.
What? In the 16th century, they had, was it like a scroll, like a long, skinny scroll?
It was basically
they didn't have spiral binding in the 16th century.
No, they didn't, but they had these long, straight sort of like portions, essentially, and then you'd basically flip through them, as like a triptych.
Neat.
Yeah, I'll have to find a link to that.
The more you know, folks.
So, you two are getting married.
Oh, bet your booty.
I think it's great because the worst thing about not being married is the loneliness. Yeah. Right, Jennifer?
Loneliness? Yes, it's the loneliness.
You're lonely?
Well, I'm with her most of the time.
Yes, I'm lonely.
How did you feel about Lonnie Anderson holding up her end of the thing with all these committee people in the short period she gets to kind of act with them?
I actually thought she was pretty good. She
I
got a
thought
laugh
so,
from
too.
me. She got a couple of laughs from me because I don't imagine that improv is Lonnie's forte, but she's great at line delivery. I've always thought her line reading is really good, and I thought she was great.
Yeah, the line that made me really laugh, because it was right before they're about to leave, or right before Jennifer is about to leave, and she uses the excuse to get out of the dinner early that, I'm sorry, I have to go. Our monkey's been ill.
Yeah.
Which is... Which I don't know whether that's a committee member line of that scene or whether it's something that Lonnie came up with in rehearsals and they just decided to keep it. It's pretty good.
It's good. That's what we've mentioned a couple of times, good exit lines and the difficulty of exit lines. Vina says,
I'm going to go buy a car.
I got to buy a car. Andy says, I got to go bowling. I just can't get out of it. And here, our monkey's been ill.
So as you said at the beginning of the episode, Johnny is kind of getting tortured by Les. The question I asked in the notes was, does Les know that Johnny can be easily made paranoid?
Yeah.
Because of, his drug history and everything? I don't know.
I think he does. This is a semi-recurring bit now, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's not done all the time, but Les gaslighting Johnny about his health, or in this case, about whether Paula is trying to kill him, right? That's what he's gaslighting about. It's a long
He hears
walk.
all these bad things about her, and then he takes it to the next level, basically.
Yeah. They just keep adding odd little bits to Les's character. And I would say that this is one that I like. It's funny that at times Les is so clueless, and at other times he's clever enough that he can that he's a sort of psycho that can gaslight people.
Well, that gets me thinking about, so at the end of the episode, of course, Herb's travel agent screws everything up because Johnny gives Herb very imprecise directions on, well, if you can't get Jamaica, just get something south of here that's remote and far away from everyone. And Johnny ends up getting tickets to Nebraska, to Omaha. And Les is very excited because of the, agricultural connection and wants to go with Johnny.
The implication at the end is that maybe Johnny will take, because Bailey is not going to Omaha, so maybe Johnny will take Les to Omaha.
Omaha's too close to Chicago. It's too close to home for her. But I want to talk about this because this is another thing that, again, 3 seasons of Les, we've talked about how slippery he can be as a character and kind of his characterization. And we're going to talk about this in the next episode explicitly, but I want to bring it up now. There seems to be 2 Leses in a lot of ways. There's the Les who, this season we've seen him loving the idea of bombing Iran back to the Stone Age and all of his anti-communist paranoia and all that stuff. But then very often they decide to make him into a different kind of 1970s stock character, which is the sort of fey kind of Paul Lynde, Charles Nelson Riley type, you know what I mean? Whose sexuality is a little bit indeterminate. And I think it's kind of unfair to give Les the burden of both of those very different character types, Well,
I don't think it's impossible to be fey and arch-conservative at the same time.
I can think of a couple people right now, actually, that fit that description.
I think that, he wears a bow tie, and that's the bow tie is like the cultural signifier that can go in either of those 2 directions.
Oh, yeah, look at that, yeah. Or maybe a few years previous to this, the ascot.
Right, an ascot, sure. Well, didn't he wear an ascot when he went on his date?
That's true, when hot-blooded, right, yeah.
So, Les's sexuality, we've said, has always been hard to pin down. Something, we didn't mention it when we did Secrets of Dayton Heights, but I was looking again at Jamie Weinman's great blog, and he posted every single WKRP episode with commentary back about 5 years ago. And he says, we'll have to watch for this. Speaking of continuity, he says that after Secrets of Dayton Heights, Les doesn't do any more red baiting.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
So we'll watch for that. He says it less sort of drops his anti-communism once he meets Harvey Morehouse.
Wow. Yeah, we will have to watch for that. But I can buy that. I mean, it seems like this end of season 3 is kind of where, I think I've talked about this before. I feel like these characters are kind of going through like they're all going through parallel like maturity processes. You know what I mean? Like the interactions that they're having on the show are kind of teaching them how to be better people in a lot of ways. And like, if we think about Herb and how he said he was going to change when it came to, harassing Jennifer, just outright harassing her. Like we've seen that's pretty much stayed the case. Yeah.
And about drinking, right? The very next episode after the one where he's drinking. Well, we mentioned it last week, the wedding episode. Yeah. He says he's not gonna get drunk at the bachelor party. Yeah. I think that, the two things we're just talking about. One, the show has taken an interest in continuity, which maybe they didn't in season 1. And the characters have developed, and I think the actors are committed to their characters. So here we have Howard Hessman writing an episode about his own character. And so those two things taken together, the actors committed to the characters, an interest in continuity, means that the characters, even if the show is not strictly serialized, the characters begin to grow. This is the classic writer thing of saying, well, the characters eventually take on a life of themselves, life of their own. I think that's happening here.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today.
All right, so our second episode is Clean Up Radio Everywhere. It's the final episode of season 3 of WKRP, and it takes on a very hot topic in 1981, the moral majority, and the moral majority's influence on the culture at large. As we've talked about many, many times, Ronald Reagan had just been elected a few months previous. He's the new president. He's been in office a couple of months at this point. And he had swept to office on a wave of evangelical Christian support. And one of those big organizations was the Moral Majority, headed by Jerry Falwell. In this episode, the big guy has to deal with the arrival at the station of Dr. Bob Holliers, who, Rob, I mean, could he be more Jerry Falwell is the question.
This is a perfect little bit of casting. That actor's name is Richard Paul. Yeah. And it's wonderful because it does half the work for them. He looks so much like Jerry Falwell. Richard Paul this would be a little side business of his. Yeah. He went on to play Falwell in The People versus Larry Flint.
And I think there's even a reaction from the audience when he first walks into the big guy's office. Again, it's the magic of having that live studio audience is that when there are things that you are meant to realize, some of the audience catches on right away, and then the others kind of, pick up the slack as they go. But you can hear a little knowing chuckle from a few of the members of the studio audience.
It's almost as if it's stunt casting, how did they get Falwell to do this episode?
I thought he was busy with stuff right now, at the White House,
Well, if you read my letters, perhaps you know that I am the head of the Tri-Faith Broadcasting Advisory Committee here in Cincinnati.
Oh, yeah, that Tri-Faith Broadcasting thing there, yeah.
Well, in that case, you may have heard that we have formed a media task force called CURB, C-U-R-B.
CURB?
It stands for Clean Up Radio Broadcasting.
Clean Up Radio Broadcasting.
Yes, and you're the very first station we're contacting in the Cincinnati area.
Oh, that's great.
Dr. Bob comes to the station with a list of songs that he and his organization, Clean Up Radio Broadcasting, or CURB, find objectionable. I find it really fascinating that the title of the episode is a different acronym than the organization in the episode. It kind of
Clean Up Radio Everywhere, which is CURE, which would also be a perfectly believable acronym.
Yeah.
But that they never say that in the episode.
Right.
Is that an error, or is that sort of significant somehow?
I think it is significant. I want to cover that when we get to let's talk about it now. I mean, the station kind of goes back and forth, you know. The DJs and Andy do not want to give in to this organization, whereas the big guy, Dr. Bob, connects with him on a religious level. They're both religious men. They're both men of faith.
Yeah, because, you know, Arthur doesn't listen to the station and he doesn't love rock music. And so, there's definitely common ground between them. And that's the whole episode is going to hinge. It is an issue episode, but it's also really a Arthur episode.
Really is.
Where Arthur is at about censorship and, you know, the questionable lyrics of rock music and that kind of thing.
And here's the interesting thing. You know, the big guy wins the day for this first list. I mean, he basically gives the edict, like, we're going to not play this particular list of songs. And, you know, again, Andy and the DJs are a little upset about it. Now, it is interesting. There's a little bit of a debate that goes on in the bullpen. I don't know if you noticed that part.
I thought it was interesting to see the reactions of the rest of the crew, the rest of the cast. Johnny, of course, is completely against this and immediately sees where it's going.
Yes.
He knows that it's not just going to be one list.
Yep.
Another list comes next week and another list after that. And
he comes across as like he's seen this before. He got fired for saying booger. I mean, you know, how much more clearly?
Yeah, he knows where this goes. That's right.
But he's at a very low burn about it, though. Like he's firm.
Yeah.
But he's not as up in arms as Andy is.
Right. And Andy, we get a little tiny tidbit of Andy's background. He says, my aunt and uncle were just like this. Yeah, that's kind of, that doesn't give us a lot of information, but sure, everybody has family. And in America, you know, everybody, all the urban red state folks have rural blue state aunts and uncles. Like that, we know that to be true, right?
Yes, that was one of the big things that happened this past Thanksgiving when people went back home, right? Have that conversation with your family. But I moved away from them so I wouldn't have to talk to them about this kind of stuff, you know? But Venus and Bailey also have a really interesting conversation. And we see, again, little hints that Venus is a little bit culturally conservative, you know?
Yes.
He's a little upset about the things he sees on TV.
Well, Bailey says it's not like the news is not worse, you know.
Yes,
so of course Bailey is against the censorship and she's on the side, but Venus, interestingly, is like, well, some of these lyrics are offensive. Yeah. Venus has that conservative streak. Once more, I think my idea for a rap episode, Hoodlum Rap, where Venus confronts rap music, season 5, they should have done it.
Yeah, they should have struck while the iron was hot there, exactly.
Andy, this is Dr. Hollier. Hi. Andy's my program director.
Yeah, that's right. I'm the program director. My job is to program the music I think our listeners would like to hear. If I'm wrong, our ratings go down and I get fired. It's called the free enterprise system, and it works pretty well.
Well, some people don't like the records you program. They fight back. It's called a democracy, and it works pretty well.
It's called censorship, and you could call it a rose if you like, but it still stinks.
Andy, please.
So, as we go through this and the big guy acquiesces to clean up radio broadcasting, it comes to the station that there's a second list. It comes accompanied with an award from Curb to the big guy.
They get an award for caving. That's right.
Yeah.
That Arthur gets an award, which is a prize for caving in to the pressure.
Which is a beautiful little touch. I mean, that's the kind of thing that these organizations, and we'll talk about them, it's the kind of thing that they would do, you know?
But then, as predicted, they get another list, and it's clear that there are songs they haven't played, so it's not reactions to them.
Yes.
That the Curb or Cure is going to continue to police the airwaves and send them a list every month. You get the sense.
And, you know, at this point, the big guy goes to Dr. Bob's office and brings with him this list and brings with him some of the lyrics that were given to him by the DJs. And specifically, they're the lyrics to John Lennon's Imagine.
This is a very memorable and famous scene. I think everybody, you know, this is one of those ones that I certainly remembered.
Yes.
And I imagine many of our listeners who watch WKRP would remember. And it's another one of those long WKRP scenes.
Yep.
Like 8 minutes or so of really, you know, kind of a complex conversation about censorship and community standards and, you know,
and citizen activism, if you want to look at it that way.
there's no question about whose side the show is on.
Yeah.
But Dr. Bob is not a raving loony.
Yeah.
He is not the Reverend Little Ed. He is like they go a little bit out of their way to let him say, to let him present his side and say, well, isn't this just, I'm exercising my democratic right? That both, I think it's interesting that Arthur says something like, it's called free enterprise, and Dr. Bob says it's called democracy. And Dr. Bob feels that what he is doing is promoting his own free speech, right? Or at least that's the language he uses. And there's no particular indication that Dr. Bob is like evil. The show doesn't endorse his point of view, but he talks the way I imagine those guys would talk. He's not a straw man.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that this is a good time to talk about where this episode came from.
Yes.
And why it was written, because Hugh Wilson had to face this exact same type of implicit boycott from the actual real life moral majority. WKRP in Cincinnati was cited as one of the shows with, quote, excessive sex and violence. This is all from our friend Michael Castle's book, and it's a great story if you have a chance to check it out. Hugh Wilson, this episode is Hugh Wilson's response to being put on a list by a community organization. The moral majority, we've talked about that a little bit in past episodes, but in the late 70s, there were a lot of these media watchdog groups popping up, both among evangelicals and Catholics, because there's also the American Family Association, which started in 1977, Donald Wildman's organization.
Yep.
There's a lot of these groups coming out, and they're coming out again of that sort of, I'll just come out and say it, that sort of for-profit religious impulse in America. And Falwell was a big mover and shaker in the 1980 election. He got evangelicals to the polls to vote for Ronald Reagan. And so now, in 1981, he's able to flex that muscle in media.
Right, exactly.
But, here's the thing, Hugh Wilson didn't want to set up a straw man and knock him down, as you were just talking about. He wanted to make this Dr. Bob character seem, I think in a lot of ways, more reasonable than Falwell was sounding in 1980. He's Dr. Bob. He's got a doctorate in divinity from one of these old sort of, evangelical training seminary schools, he can argue a point. He knows rhetoric. He knows how to pose his argument, and he always uses honey before he uses the vinegar. You know what I mean? Like he tries to connect with the big guy on a religious level. Then he gives with the big guy the award. But then when the big guy doesn't want to follow what he's doing anymore, then the hammer comes down. And the hammer, as we were just saying, is an economic one.
Right. That's the threat. The carrot is the award and the friendship of this fellow Christian.
Yep.
But if he doesn't play ball, well, then we're going to have to start pressuring your advertisers, and they start to boycott anyone who advertises on WKRP. And, that's not an empty threat for WKRP, which barely has any advertisers anyway. So there is somebody says in the episode, like, why are they picking on us? We're this tiny little unsuccessful station. And somebody else says, they want to get a few guppies before they go after the big whale.
And boy, does that not, that's so evocative of a lot of the stuff that's been happening recently. I can't even describe it.
You go after a few guppies before. Yeah. One person in the cast reaction we didn't mention, Les has a funny little bit where he says that when he gets confused, he watches television, and he makes a little box sign with his hand. He says, because television makes everything simple.
Yeah.
It puts everything inside a little box. And I felt like that was Wilson being meta there.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Not only meta, but like less being almost McLuhan-esque, like, know, radio being a hot medium and TV being a cool one, It's like, you don't have to do much with TV. You just kind of have to sit there and bask in it.
I have to sit there, but of course, but Wilson is, as I said, we know what side he's on, but he is, I think, doing an admirable effort, especially in that scene with Arthur and Dr. Bob, to play out both sides of the conversation.
Arthur, this is typical of the kind of secular, liberal, humanist point of view that gluts our airwaves.
Yeah, but we're not talking obscenities here anymore, Bob. We're talking about ideas, political and philosophical ideas. First you censor a word, and then you censor the ideas.
Arthur, this song says there's no heaven.
No, it says just imagine there's no heaven.
And then it culminates, they go back and forth on whether they're censoring words or ideas. And it culminates in Arthur opening up this piece of paper and reading the lyrics to John Lennon's Imagine and saying, well, what do you think of this?
Yeah.
And this is, I think, the moment that everybody remembers, or at least that I remember. What do you think of that bit particularly?
Obviously, up to this point, we've talked a lot about the historical context of this episode when it comes to the moral majority and Jerry Falwell. But I think we also have to realize something. John Lennon had just been assassinated just a couple of months ago at this point. In fact, while this episode was being recorded, he might have just been assassinated. And so this has to be, on one level, it's just a tribute to John Lennon. I'm sure the people like Howard Hesseman on the cast, and even Hugh Wilson probably had an enormous amount of respect for him. You know, he reads off the lyrics, imagine no possessions, imagine no countries, imagine no religion. You know, all of the bits of this song that kind of just, you know, at this point, can Imagine connect on an emotional level with any of us? Have we heard it so much that it doesn't feel fresh anymore? Coming out of Gordon Jumps / Arthur Carlson's mouth.
Yes.
All of a sudden.
In April 1980, 4 months after Lennon's death.
Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine's one of those songs that, like, for people of our generation, you almost can't imagine a time when that song didn't exist.
Yes, exactly.
There's actually, this has always stayed with me. There's an episode of Quantum Leap where Scott Bakula, he's the older brother or the younger brother of some girl who loves the Beatles.
Yeah.
And he convinces her that he's from the future by singing Imagine to her.
Oh, wow.
And she starts to cry because, like, the song is so good that clearly she believes him that it's John's song, but it doesn't exist. Anyway.
It's a generational, like, signpost, you know, it's
right. It's you know, it's so simple and it's so beautiful, even if it now is sort of overused, but it does have power in that moment. And it must have had such power in that moment. I mean, I have thought over the years that one way in which it, maybe the note is just slightly false, is that I have thought over the years that, like, not completely convinced that Dr. Bob would fall for it that easily. In other words, that the song is so beautiful and poetic and non-offensive that he would be duped. You know, always seems to me like the kind of platonic ideal of a
hippie song, basically,
of a hippie song, but of like a hippie song, a rock song that would be in, like, your grade 9 English anthology or something like that. Like a song that is like,
you could see Blowin' in the Wind or something like that being used as well. Yeah. I see where you're coming from.
And he says, you know, no possessions. That sounds like communism, Arthur. And then, of course, you know, where the trap that he walks right into is he says, this song says there's no God. And Arthur says wonderfully, no, Dr. Bob, it says, imagine there's no God. And he has gotten Bob to basically out himself, not just as caring about filthy language, but as being prepared to censor ideas and even inquiry and even this beautiful, you know, and completely non-threatening bit of song.
I see where you're coming from on this, but I think we need to remember that at a certain point in his life, John Lennon was threatening.
Yeah.
And the ideas that he was putting out there, which again today may seem, with the patina of time being a little bit hackneyed and obvious, at the time were powerful enough for him to be watched by the FBI.
Yeah.
And be persecuted by the FBI. And Dr. Bob saying that about it sounding like communism and it being atheistic, really what it is, it's just a sort of like a facet of the earlier sort of Nixon years of people being afraid of these kind of ideas. And on that level, I think it worked really well because it connects up with that continuum of Nixon, Hoover, you know, that whole sort of thing that Lennon went through.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think that me watching it as a Canadian in the late 80s, it was difficult for me to connect with the idea that John Lennon's Imagine had ever been dangerous, right? But I see what you're saying.
Yeah. I think especially, I mean, again, that came out in 1970. This is right when he was, you know, there were bed-ins, anti-war. I mean, it's, you know, that kind of stuff. The kids listened to these people, you know what I mean? And people like Hoover were worried that the kids would listen to these people a little too much, you know? But again, it's 1981 now, and Ronald Reagan is the president, so maybe there is no danger. I don't know. It's very interesting. It really, this episode is only going to look more interesting 20 more years down the line. And 40 more years down the line. I think that it's not going to lose its pertinence anytime soon.
Sadly, no. And I think we did want to talk a little bit about later examples of kind of rock radio censorship. But before we get to that, this is not the end of the episode. I remembered, and you may well have remembered this as being the kind of big emotional note at the end of the episode. But there's a whole other long scene where, Arthur, the station decides to fight or to continue to play the music they want to play. Dr. Bob makes good on his threat, starts boycotting their sponsors. They start losing sponsors right and left. And we have a scene where WKRP's first sponsor, the guy who's been with them since before the format change, Harvey Green, the owner of Red Wigglers, the Cadillac of Worms, continuity. In fact, we hear a Red Wigglers commercial early in the episode. It's Chekhov's Red Wiggler, because you hear the Red Wiggler commercial, a callback early in the episode, and that's setting up Harvey, who is obviously a longtime friend of Arthur's, comes sadly to basically apologize for pulling his sponsorship of the station.
I might as well just start off by saying this. Could there be a more perfect coda to season 3 of WKRP than this final scene of Clean Up Radio Everywhere? I mean, it encapsulates everything we've talked about this season. The downer trajectory of a lot of the plot lines. I mean, this episode ends on a down note. I mean, there's no redemption at the end. They're going to fight. That's great. But they lost Red Wigglers. And, Harvey himself, as you say, is so obviously saddened by this. The entire scene is just draped in this, like, it's almost Godfather-like. It's like this betrayal
because they're sort of going off to die because Harvey kind of,
oh God, yeah,
he holds out like, well, maybe it's just time to get forced out of the business. His sons aren't interested in worms, so he briefly floats the idea of letting Dr. Bob drive him out of business, and then he and Arthur can go down to Florida and fish together.
Yeah.
Which is, it's a nice little vision, but...
and boy, how perfect is it to get into the whole sort of like fishing and Jesus like parallels in this episode too. I think the one thing that really pleased me a little bit, the guy who played Harvey Green, he plays him with, I think, what feels like a really authentic sort of like New York Yiddish theater accent. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that guy, his name's Ralph Mazza, I think.
Yeah.
Ralph Manza.
Yeah.
And he is, Yiddish. He does read as, like, he's probably Jewish. He's in roughly the same space as that lousy, I'm just an old man from another country guy from Mile in My Shoes, but much better done, subtler, and with more heart. That actor, among other things, I think he was on like 8 Barney Millers.
Yeah.
And you could totally see him in the Barney Miller verse. You know?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. But I mean, I when you said that like they were thinking about just going down to Florida and giving up, I mean, like I mentioned this a little earlier, but like the big guy, again, he's mainline Protestant, he teaches Sunday school. He's got a good moral compass. His moral universe does not allow for censorship. Dr. Bob's does.
Yes.
And when Harvey says that about just going away to Florida and just disappearing forever, I mean, it makes you think that the time for this kind of reasonableness, this kind of middle of the road sort of, live and let live conservatism is on its way out.
Yeah.
And another aspect of the preparation for this episode was that Hugh Wilson took this script to Gordon Jump. And this is also in the Castle booking. Hugh Wilson asked Gordon Jump, what do you think about censorship?
Jump himself being being a Christian and being, being a lot of ways, morally and politically very close to Arthur. Yeah.
Later on, Gordon Jump became a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It may have been around this time, but he, I think he was known as having a lot of, having a profound sense of faith. And he said that I don't believe in censorship. I believe if you bring people up right, they'll choose right. They'll choose correctly.
Yeah.
And at that point, Hugh Wilson says, well, read this script and read the lines I gave for you and tell me what you think. And he said, I think this says it all. I think this says it perfectly. Once you start censoring ideas, you're censoring ways for people to express themselves, Gordon Jump said. And I don't believe in that. So, Gordon Jump's performance in this scene with Dr. Bob and the scene with Harvey, they're both phenomenal. I mean, he doesn't get asked to do a ton of comedic work in this episode. It's mostly dramatic, but it's not overly dramatic. It's matter of fact. The big guy looks at this stuff as just self-evident. To him, I can understand why you wouldn't want filthy sex on the radio because it's everybody's airwaves. But once you start getting into those ideas, like you were talking about earlier, that's when it goes too far. But the question becomes, Rob, can we even give an inch? Can we give Dr. Bob the hoodlum rocks of the world? and say we're not going to play Scum of the Earth on the air anymore, and instead, say that's where it's going to stop. But it never stops.
The next witness will be Mr. Frank Zappa.
These are my personal observations and opinions. I speak on behalf of no group or professional organization. The PMRC proposal is an ill-conceived piece of nonsense which fails to deliver any real benefits to children, infringes the civil liberties of people who are not children, and promises to keep the courts busy for years dealing with the interpretational and enforcemental problems inherent in the proposal's design. It is my understanding that, in law, First Amendment issues are decided with a preference for the least restrictive alternative. In this context, the PMRC demands are the equivalent of treating dandruff by decapitation. No one has forced Mrs. Baker or Mrs. Gore to bring Prince or Sheena Easton into their homes. Thanks to the Constitution, they are free to buy other forms of music for their children. Apparently, they insist on purchasing the works of contemporary recording artists in order to support a personal illusion of aerobic sophistication. Ladies, please be advised, the $8.98 purchase price does not entitle you to a kiss on the foot from the composer or performer in exchange for a spin on the family Victrola.
Maybe this is a good transition to go into real-life Dr. Bob's of the future at this point. Because as we were talking about, Rob, this is torn from the headlines of 1981, but as you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, this stuff doesn't stop with the moral majority in the early 80s. It goes on, it expands out from a specifically evangelical right-wing milieu into the greater culture.
Yes. And I have to admit, just as I was saying about Imagine there before, that I have... Certainly for a long time, I had trouble taking this issue as seriously as some people do. And I think that my thinking about it was formed by, in the mid-'80s, the famous PMRC Senate hearings.
Yeah.
This is the Parent Music Resource Center, founded by Tipper Gore, famously, wife of Al Gore, and Susan Baker, wife of James Baker, the Treasury Secretary.
Yes.
Founded this group, the PMRC, to...
it's bipartisan, right? There.
Exactly. A little bit of that, it's quaint in that way that, this bipartisan senatorial wives or bipartisan Washington wives. And they managed to have some hearings in Washington. And this is where parental advisory stickers come out of this process.
Yeah.
The sort of stickers, the Recording Industry Association of America agreed to put parental advisory stickers. And famously, they had these crazy, they had these Senate hearings, on explicit lyrics and I don't know how they picked this collection of people, but, Frank Zappa, John Denver,
sure,
and Dee Snider of Twisted Sister all went to Washington, Mr. Smith-like, and testified before the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee.
Wow.
Zappa, Denver, and of course, a friend of the podcast, my longtime friend, Adam, every single time we have an episode, comments on Facebook connecting the episode to Frank Zappa. So here we actually have something that directly connects to Frank Zappa. So we got to talk about that. But I want to talk about all those guys because they're fun. That's such a great rogues gallery of Zappa, Denver, and Snider. A dream team of weirdness, like how that comes together. But my sense in the 80s, now looking back, maybe I was naive. Almost certainly I was naive. But there was something I didn't take it seriously because it seemed to me so clearly performative on both sides. In other words, that the Tipper Gores and the kind of, the pearl-clutching congressional wives need the long-haired Dee Sniders every bit as much as the long-haired Dee Sniders need the pearl-clutching congressional wives. Like, both of them give each other publicity and help and confirm who they want to be. Like, I just felt it was so obvious that they were using each other.
Yeah.
And I didn't take censorship seriously as a, record labeling did not, in fact, destroy music, nor did it measurably slow the coarsening of the culture. This is, but fast forward, another 20 years in the wake of 9/11, they did ban Imagine. There's a famous Clear Channel list of songs. They weren't banned, but they a list of songs not to play after 9/11 that would freak people out, or that some of them were like songs about airplane crashes, and so it was that kind of thing.
Sure, no Fire and Rain, yeah.
But on the other hand, like, Imagine.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, in 1985, when this committee was going strong, media consolidation hadn't gotten to the point where there was only one company that could determine what 70% of radio stations were going to play. These warning stickers went on as a quote-unquote voluntary measure by the record industry. But at the same time, there weren't any, media conglomerates saying from the top down, you can't play off of the PMRC's Filthy 15 list or whatever. What makes the 9/11 thing really scary, it's stupid, don't get me wrong. The 9/11 list was really stupid, but it was scary because all of a sudden, there's markets where there aren't venues for music other than Clear Channel, supported or backed stations or other huge conglomerate-owned stations. So all of a sudden, there's nowhere you can hear this stuff on the radio. And so Dr. Bob's dream becomes reality through the applied force, not of economic boycott, but of economic control.
Right.
And that's what makes the whole idea of censorship these days so much scarier, is that there aren't as many big alternative venues to get messages out. So there are these tiny choke points at the top of each of these 5 big, huge media conglomerates.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so of course, I'm more scared by the Clear Channels of the world than by...
We talked about this during Preacher, yeah.
Yeah, right, than by Dr. Bob or Reverend Little Ed.
Little Ed.
Arthur, I'm sorry, but I don't think I can stand a boycott of my product right now.
I understand.
With the way the economy is and everything, I can't even get a loan. And a lot of religious people fish.
Oh, boy, I know. And there's no sense in all of us going down the drain.
You lost a lot of business, Arthur?
No, I'm doing all right.
The morality of economic boycotts kind of gets me wondering. We find Dr. Bob's ability to turn the sponsors of WKRP against them to be sinister and weird and mean. But I think one of the things that people have been using over the past few years to fight things like HB2 in North Carolina and the flag controversy in South Carolina are economic boycotts.
Yes.
And economic boycotts have been used for things like, the protests in the South during Jim Crow. They've been used successfully by people that, we think have the moral high ground. And I always find it interesting when I look at libertarian and more mainline conservatives bemoaning the economic boycott as a method of citizen action. They always go, well, this leads down a very, very dangerous path. You don't know where this might go if people start using their economic power. And I'm like, well, what other kind of power do people have?
Yeah.
In a late capitalist, neoliberal sort of, environment. They only have their dollars.
I don't know how I feel about boycotts as politics. If we're all high-minded and righteous about the evils of Dr. Bob, then presumably it applies to using your dollars on the other side, I guess.
I guess it always does boil down to who has the more dollars, though. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of one of those things where if you have very little leverage, you've got to use the leverage you have. People like Dr. Bob don't just have their followers and their pocketbooks. Dr. Bob has connections. Dr. Bob has other preachers who can spread that word. Presumably he's got a media megaphone somewhere that lets him get this message out to folks, whether it's direct mail, like was being, pioneered in the 1970s, or televangelism or whatever the other people who used it in the 80s had,
Yeah. Well, I guess I believe in more voices and more and choice. And, I was about to say a marketplace of ideas, although I'd prefer a different metaphor than a marketplace given the conversation we're having.
Yes,
but,
exactly.
Yeah. The people, Dr. Bob and his flock should not listen to WKRP if they don't like the music.
Yep.
And nobody is forcing me to read Breitbart, and I'm not going to.
Yeah.
When Breitbart got into it with Kellogg's and they pulled their advertising, and some people said, let's boycott Kellogg's, and we ran out and bought some Kellogg's cereal trying to show our support. Breitbart called Kellogg's, said that they were standing up to the left-wing cereal giant, which I found funny.
If you know your history, you know that that's not necessarily the case.
Not know the case, although somebody on Twitter said, left-wing cereal giant is the hero we need right now.
I agree. As a Gen Xer who loves his old cereals, I totally agree with that. Where is King Vitaman? Have him tear down his crown and fight for the people, right?
King Vitaman, I love him. Quisp.
Yes, exactly.
Arthur has his last words to Dr. Bob are about...
Oh, God, wasn't that great? Jeez.
Yeah, he warns Dr. Bob at the end. He says, okay, you know, some people are going to cave to you.
Bob, watch out for those broadcasters that cave in to your pressure. Because principle's not going to mean a darn thing to them. All they're going to be doing is saving their swimming pools. Oh, they'll be the first ones to come and sit at your table. But I think the good ones are going to be the ones that are willing to take a loss and put up a fight.
Well, then I'll have to learn to love my enemies, Arthur, like the good book says.
I hope so. Because I don't think you're going to be able to trust your friends.
Boy, I felt like that was talking about media today. Like in this, you know, today when Teen Vogue is doing a better job than the New York Times in reporting on the president-elect. Like I just felt like, so for 20 years I thought this episode was good but a little bit overwrought, and now in 2017 I thought Arthur was talking to us, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't add to that.
Since the big one ended, we'd been mostly pretending we'd have had the same gumption and grit as the greatest among us. When harm came upon us, we wouldn't hesitate to defend. But with or against, something's been out to get us, and it looked like something finally did. No nobler cause in our lifetime for setting our sails to the wind. That band, imagine it became the same old it's always been. Once that band, imagine it became the war it was when we were kids. Once that band, imagine it became the same old war it's always been. Once that band, imagine it became the war it was when we were kids.
Oh, one very quick one. There is a nice clear shot of the diabetes poster.
I noticed that, yes.
We teach diabetes survival. And in fact, the diabetes poster is a poster from the American Diabetes Association.
Well, there you go.
So there's your answer, Fishbulb.
What are you doing?
Playing computer baseball.
Why?
Because, Andy, recently this is one of the few joys I've had in life.
And just to end this episode on a completely self-indulgent note, Rob, boy, oh boy, the big guy has moved into the 1980s as well. He is exactly what Herb has been asking for. He is a man of the 80s because he has left behind his lead figurines and he has moved into the exciting world of handheld electronic games.
Oh, that was wonderful, wasn't it? And it turns out, at first you don't know, you just get to hear the bleeps and bloops, but later he does let us know that it's electronic baseball, which is just wonderful and cute. And
I tried to figure it out from the shape of the sort of back of the machine, and
the shape
I was
of
like,
the thing.
that's either the football. They're all beige back then, right? Like they're all
beige. And well, yeah, because I don't know which ones. Did you have electronic baseball?
Rob, we've talked about this before in the Christmas episodes. I had everything. Yes, I had.
You had everything. I had Simon, which I loved because, of course, it's shaped like a telephone.
Oh, yeah.
But I love of the telephone.
There was Merlin.
Oh, Merlin is the one that looked like the phone, not
phone,
Simon.
Yeah. Simon's.
Right. Simon is memory, and it's a circle. It looks like the Google Chrome logo. Merlin is the one that looked like a phone. Yes.
They're all named after famous magicians, you know, Simon Magus and Merlin.
Yeah, I had Mandrake and named some other Fu Manchu, named some famous magicians.
The John D, yeah. Did you know that Simon had a debut at Studio 54? That was its launch party in 1978. It was launched in May 1978 at Studio 54, and they brought a whole bunch of copies of Simon up for people to play. I mean, if you're on coke, it's probably a really fun game to play because you got to hit the buttons real fast.
It's super fun. You can run lines off it or something. Now I want to find some way of crossing that over with you were saying we still need to have a kind of Russia House movie about
Rubik's
the
Cube.
Rubik's Cube coming to America during the Cold War.
Simon was great.
But yeah, and the other one I had I had a little beige sports game where the graphic screen was pretty much just red dots.
Yes.
And then it came with little plastic inserts that you could pull the insert out and change it from being basketball to football. I don't know if there was baseball, but to soccer or hockey. It had hockey, of course, just by sliding in a different plastic insert and flipping a switch on the back. And then the dots would, behave slightly differently.
Yeah. Well, those slots, those slot-in cards, they had like little circuit boards inside that would change. It was basically for handheld games that didn't have any kind of onboard memory.
Oh, no. This was, mine was more working class than that. These were just pieces of plastic.
Cutouts. Okay. They also had, you remember that robot that took 8-track tapes, 2XL?
Oh my God, I don't, but that just right there, that sounds like a movie. It's a robot that takes 8-track tapes.
It's a jive-talking robot, exactly.
Eastern Bloc cowboy robot.
You put the 8-track in his little belly, and like the buttons would have different.
Did he do something, or did he just play Foghat?
He could play Foghat. He doubled as an 8-track player, but if it was a program tape, you'd put it in, and he'd ask you trivia questions, and he'd ask you them verbally. Like he'd say, "What is the answer to this?" And you'd press the button that matched the answer.
Oh, you used the multiple tapes.
Yes.
That provided the wow. This is like
very solid state, baby.
Solid state. Exactly. I don't know if it's worth explaining that we once, Mike and I and other friends once had a long conversation of what the 70s equivalent of steampunk would be. That is, if steampunk is a computer revolution in the 19th century using 19th century steam technology, what if you had a sort of far future technology extrapolated solely from 70s audio? So in other words,
wood paneling and
computers made out of 8 tracks approaching the singularity, what that would be. And Solid State was one of our best, along with Funk Punk. Solid State was one of our best names for that.
Oh, that's great. Hey, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back again soon with more WKRP riffs and memories. If you like this enough to listen to the whole thing, tell somebody about it.
You can find us on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Facebook and Twitter, and at holdmyorderterribledresser.com, which wasn't taken. We always appreciate your clicks, your stars, your reviews, your comments, your tweets, your emails. Don't be strangers.
Good day, and may the good news be yours.
Baby, if you've ever wondered whatever became of me, I'm living on the air in Cincinnati, WKRP. I'm at WKRP in Cincinnati.